Hello. It's great to be able to study the scriptures and to consider different passages, different individuals in the Bible, even men of God. And we're thinking here particularly just now of Hezekiah, because our theme for these moments is the theme of revival and the importance of being in a place where God can come in revival upon his church and upon his people in these days. And Hezekiah here at this particular time, our focus then, as we have noticed, has been just on 2 Chronicles. We will also bring in 2 Kings, we'll bring in what's recorded of him in Isaiah as we go through the studies, but our basis we will find in the book of 2 Chronicles. You know, Hezekiah was a young man who put himself in the way of revival. Himself, the leaders, the people, and we know that God came in revival at that particular time. It's amazing. We read the verse, and I want to read it again. We read it last week. So the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. Verse 36 of 2 Chronicles 29. Then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people, since the events took place so suddenly. So God came down, preparing people and moving people to follow the example of Hezekiah, who had put himself in the way of revival. And here we're told that the events took place so suddenly. Revival comes here. And that's what we want to see in our own lives personally, but also in these days in our churches and our fellowships, that God moves among us. What can we say then about Hezekiah? Well, I'm going to go outside 2 Chronicles here to 2 Kings for a moment in chapter 18, verse 4 and 5. Because we read some very commendable things about Hezekiah there. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars. He cut down the wooden image and broke in pieces even the bronze serpent that Moses had made. That's broken in pieces. We read here also, he trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah. That's what they can say about him, nor any who were before him. So those are the commendations that were made about Hezekiah at that particular time when 2 Kings is being written. Later on, if you go into the New Testament to the book of Hebrews, for example, it's interesting how that Hezekiah doesn't really get a mention in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 32 to 34. Let me quote to you what that chapter says. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, and Samson, Jephthah, also David and Samuel, the prophets, who through faith subdues kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. That's what we have in Hebrews 11, 32 to 34. But there's no Hezekiah. He's not mentioned there at that particular time. Because, there were ways in which Hezekiah also stumbled. And we need to be careful. We're going to see a young man on fire for God here. But, we must always remember that throughout all our lifetime we want to follow God. We want to be faithful to him to the very end. It's so important that we don't lose out with God in later life. And we may see something of that when it comes to the life even of Hezekiah. What can we say then about Hezekiah? Well, first of all, here you've got his ascension. He comes to the throne in chapter 28 into 29. Chapter 28 talks about Ahaz who rests with his fathers. That's his father. He's buried in the city. They didn't bring him into the tombs of the kings. He shamed Israel. He didn't come in there. But Hezekiah, his son, comes to reign in his place, and he becomes king here. He ascends to the throne now as chapter 29 opens. So he's following Ahaz, following those dark days that the nation has gone through when there was such idolatry. It's interesting, that in the background, we could say the prophets. In the background, we have people like Isaiah, we have Hosea, we have the prophet Micah. If you look through different scriptures, you will find out that all those prophets are mentioned around this time in the history of the nation. And it's interesting that their preaching must have been an impact, especially in Judah here. It must have been an impact. And of course, Hezekiah was very much in touch with Isaiah. He's mentioned quite a few times, and we'll see that as we go through these chapters. That's his ascension. He comes to the throne. Note his age, because we're told here, just in the opening verses, in fact in verse 1, he was 25 years old. A young man. But he was willing to put himself, as we're going to see, in the way of revival. It's very interesting here. That's his age. And God can use even a young man as an example. He can use a young man as an instrument and make him an example, as we're going to see. It's clear that God uses particular men in revival. Sometimes people get uneasy about who they are, and maybe not all of them are those that we want to recognize, but we have to recognize this, that God uses his own men in revival. There are people, you can go through the scriptures, you'll find Abraham, a Joseph, a Moses, a Joshua, a Gideon, a Samuel, Daniel, Nehemiah, Peter, a Paul. But when you come into later times, you've got people like Count Zinzendorf, you've got a Jonathan Edwards, you've got a George Whitefield, you've got a John Wesley, you've got a Dwight Moody, you've got a Duncan Campbell, and you've got a W.P. Nicholson. All men that God put his hand on and used in moments of revival. And Hezekiah was one of these men that God put his hand on. We're going to look at the quality of his life, because revival is always a personal thing. No one will be used in revival who is not himself first revived. And it's interesting, we can say that of Hezekiah, that he met God in a powerful and in a personal way. And he had that burning passion for the glory of God and for a life of holiness. We can see that. And the revival then swept the nation that began in the heart of the king. God can use the young. Spurgeon was 16 when he started to preach. 4 years after that, he moved then to a building in Southwark that would seat 5,000 people. And then shortly after that, we come to the Metropolitan Tabernacle, and he's preaching to 6,000 to 8,000 people every Sunday evening. 60 members, new members, are added to the church every month. A young man. He started when he was just 16. So God, you see, can use us even when we're young. Use the old as well, of course, but he can stir our hearts. We can be yielded to him, and we can step out to serve him. And we can give, when we're young, we can give our whole life to God. That's the important thing. Have we yielded our life to God? How's it with us now, even in older life? Are we still yielding our lives to God? So you've got the ascension and you've the age. He was just, as we said, 25 years of age. But then we've got not only the age and the ascension, but the acts of Hezekiah. Well, we're told here in verse 2 that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. Now, two things to notice here. It's not his father Ahaz had done. There was no example from Ahaz. He did what was right according to all that his father David had done. He's following the example of David, and he's been faithful to the Lord in the example of David. You can see that here so clearly. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, everything, we could talk about his personal holiness. Everything is in line with the holy character of God when it comes to Hezekiah's life at this time. Everything is in line. If we are going to be in revival, we must be willing to surrender anything and everything so that our lives can be kept clean. That's very important. Everything has to be surrendered to God, We need to get to a place where we fear only God and sin and nothing else. So this is a factor, in the powerlessness of the work of the kingdom today. Being right and doing right, those are the things that are lacking. And we need to be precise in holiness. That's an important point to make. We have to become touch sensitive regarding sin, We need that passion for holiness which Hezekiah had, Robert Pascoe reminds us that in 1839 you've got Robert Murray McShane, who was mightily used in Dundee, and he could pray. He could say, Lord, make me as holy a saved sinner as any saved sinner can be. Make me as holy as a saved sinner can be. So important that we seek to be holy in the presence of God. We need to think of those words of David in Psalm 139. We have them in verse 23 and 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties. See if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. We have to get to the place where we say, oh God, just you search me. If there's anything that shouldn't be there, Lord, I want to be holy before you. We want to be completely clean before you so we can be used by you. That's where Hezekiah was at this particular time. We're told he did what was right. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Even in the sight of the Lord, mind you, we must remember that all things are naked and opened, we're told in Hebrews 4:13, to the eyes of him with whom we have to give account or have to do. He sees everything, and we have to be prepared to put it all out of our lives, any sin that comes between us and God. So that's the acts. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. That's the important point. But also, we can see here what he did as far as the temple is concerned, his actions. Verse 3 tells us this: in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. The first year of his reign, the first month of that year. It's interesting, it's the first action of his reign. And it should be understood then as significant here in the way it's put. There's a priority been stressed here. There's something he sees as before everything else, he opens the doors of the house of the Lord and repairs them. He's concerned here about the relationship of his people with God. His relationship with God, we know where that was, but he wants the doors to be opened, that the people also will have a relationship with God. The doors are open. Those doors that were closed during Ahaz's reign, those doors are now opened again. There's going to be intercession and contact with God in the future. So that's, we could say about his ascension, Hezekiah's ascension, his age. He's so young at this time, but he's empowered by God. And then his actions, as he does what's right. He's got personal holiness and opens the door. He's got personal contact with God And he wants his people also to have personal contact with God. The acts. Then there's the appeal that he makes here. You've got that from verse 4 to verse 7. We're told in verse 4, then he brought in the priests and the Levites, and he gathered them in the east square, and he said to them, hear me, Levites, now sanctify yourselves, sanctify the house of the Lord God of your fathers, carry out the rubbish from the holy place, for our fathers have trespassed and done evil in the eyes of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him, they've turned their faces away from the dwelling place of the Lord and turned their backs on him. They've shut up the doors of the vestibule, put out the lamps. They have not burned incense or offered burnt offering in the holy place to the God of Israel. And that's why the wrath of God has come upon them. So now he was calling upon them to open the doors and clean out the rubbish. We can see that so clearly. This appeal goes out here so strong that the whole house is made ready for the worship of God and seeking to follow God, So clear here. So important that all things are made right. Maybe the temple of our lives has to be cleaned out as well, to be sure that everything, we have a real dynamic relationship with him of daily communion. We can see that so clearly. It's so important that daily communion with God, that's renewed again, just as it was here in the life of Hezekiah. It's interesting, to go through some of the accounts of revival. We mentioned one revival in New York, of course, the 1857 revival. Jeremiah Lamphere, he was the businessman, who had this burden for prayer once again, to call on God. And he put this advertisement in the weekly noonday, the paper, that there was going to be a weekly noonday prayer meeting. This is in New York. This is the Dutch church in New York on Fulton Street in downtown New York. So he put this ad in the paper, that he wanted people to come to this weekly noonday prayer meeting. Well, that first time the room we had hired was there, but very few came. In fact, half an hour later, a few people started to arrive, and then there were six. Six turned up on that occasion, 6 people. But the next week, there were 20 came. And that was the beginning of that famous Fulton Street prayer meeting. And by October, that prayer meeting had grown so much, and within 6 months, 10,000 businessmen were meeting in prayer. 10,000 by October were meeting to pray in New York, crying to God for revival. No wonder the revival came, because of their contact with God. We think of the Lewis revival, just to mention that one, in 1949. I love the story of the 2 elderly sisters, Peggy Smith and her sister Christine. And Peggy's 84, she's blind. Christine is 82, she's bent double with arthritis. They couldn't attend worship, but they were praying to God for revival, that revival would come to Barvis. They were claiming that promise in Isaiah 44 and verse 3, for I will pour water on him who is thirsty and floods on the dry ground. I will pour my spirit on your descendants and my blessing on your offspring. And, at the time when they were praying that promise day after day, that God would come and pour out his blessing, at the same time, there were 7 young men meeting on the other side of the island, and God was searching their hearts. And that Psalm 24, 3-5, about having clean hands and a pure heart, God was working in their hearts, And in the early hours of the morning, this lady, Peggy Smith, had a vision, and she saw the churches crowded with people, hundreds been swept into the kingdom of God. And she sent for the minister, sent word for the minister to tell him there was a revival coming, and he must gather the elders and the deacons together into the church, because God was going to come. And that was the time when the revival came, the Lewis revival. Wonderful, when people prayed, got in touch with God again, We can see that here in the young Hezekiah. And of course, this relationship with God is renewed because he calls for them to remove all defilement here. And he calls for them to throw everything out of the temple. And we're told here, if I can just read in verse 15 to 16 of 29, they brought out all the debris that they found. These are the priests and the Levites. They brought out all the debris that they found in the temple of the Lord, the court of the house of the Lord. And the Levites took it out and carried it to the brook Kidron, and it was all tossed in the river. They cleansed the whole sanctuary. And so it has to be with us. Our inner sanctuary has to be clean. We think of Psalm 19 and verse 14. Let the words of my lips, that's outward, and the meditation of my heart, that's inner, be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. All defilement, even our inner life, our thought life, we need to cleanse it away to be pure and holy before God. And so you have here the ascension as he comes to the throne, and the age is so young. The axe as he does right with the Lord and opens the doors of the temple and appeals to everybody to cleanse the whole house. And then there's the atonement which is offered here, because we're told when we come down later in the chapter, verse 20 to 21, we'll just see this and see what it says here. Then King Hezekiah rose early, gathered the rulers of the city, went up to the house of the Lord, and they brought 7 bulls and 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats. Why? For a sin offering, for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. The atonement is here. After the cleansing, there's the atonement. He brings the sacrifices, the rams, the bulls, the lambs, the goats, for a sin offering, for the kingdom, for the whole kingdom, for the sanctuary, and also for Judah. There has to be cleansing, confession and cleansing. And they bring the offering, lay their hands upon the offerings. So they're saying, this is for our sin. This is for us and what we've done wrong. They're confessing their sin, and they're renewing their whole relationship with God. That's the atonement. It's so important. 1 John 1 verse 9, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. We need to get to that place where we recognize again the precious blood has been paid, the price has been paid that brings to us cleansing from all unrighteousness, that brings to us renewal in the presence of God. That's the abundance, the atonement that happened here. There's an abundance here at this particular time, because as we read on here, we're told that Hezekiah encouraged the people to bring sacrifices and thank offerings. And there was so much brought that the priests couldn't handle it. It's an amazing situation. We're told, he says actually in verse 31, Hezekiah answered and said, now that you've consecrated yourselves to the Lord, come near. Bring sacrifices, thank offerings into the house of the Lord. So the assembly brought the sacrifices, the thank offerings, and as many as were of a willing heart. That's very important. As many as were of a willing heart brought the burnt offerings. The number was so great here. We're told there was an abundance actually. We're told that they couldn't handle even everything that was brought. It says in verse 35, also the burnt offerings were in abundance, with the fat of the peace offerings and with the drink offerings and with every burnt offering. There was an abundant response as God moved on the hearts of the people. An ascension here. He comes to the throne. His age, he's 25. His acts are that he's holy before God. He does right. And he opens the doors of the house of the Lord. He appeals to the priests, the Levites, to cleanse the whole house. There's the atonement as they confess their sin and the abundance that results when the appeal comes to bring the sacrifices, the peace offerings, and so on. And then finally there's the acknowledgement. We're told here in verse 35 and 36, so the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. Then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people. They acknowledged this. There's an acknowledgement. God has been at work here. God has moved in these people. God has brought this abundance. God's at work here. They rejoiced that God had prepared the people since the events took place so suddenly. Suddenly, God had come in revival. Why? A young man, he put himself in the way of revival. He called on the priests and the Levites and the people to open the doors of the house, to bring out the rubbish, to put themselves in the way of revival. And then God came. Isn't that wonderful? God came. We must take note of how this happened in the life of this king, in the life of these people. We must get to the place where we know what it is to cleanse ourselves, to be holy, to have nothing between us and God, to put ourselves in the way of revival, personal revival. That revival begins in us, and then it reaches out to others as well. So start a work in me. That's what Edwin Orr said many years ago. Lord, when he talks about this revival coming, he says, start the work in me. That's where it's got to start. It's got to start in me. It's got to start in you, as it started in Hezekiah. And may God indeed enable us to put ourselves in the way of revival, as Hezekiah also did. May God bless you.